Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Kimmage, the director of the Kennan Institute, and it's a real pleasure and privilege to introduce today's distinguished guest. This is Jake Sullivan, the Kissinger Professor of Practice of Statecraft and World Order at Harvard's Kennedy School. I'll speak in a moment about his government career, which is, of course, pertinent to today's conversation, but I want to mention as well that with John Feiner, who will be a guest next week in this series of conversations about the origins of the war, Jake Sullivan is the host of a podcast called The Long Game. We have a podcast or sort of video series here at the Kennan Institute called The Long View, but this is called The Long Game. And for those interested in sort of further iterations of conversations like this, would urge you to take note of that. I could go through a long CV. I'm just going to isolate the most obvious detail, which is that Jake Sullivan was National Security Advisor in the Biden administration, and so had intensive dealings with Russia at the time that Russia invaded Ukraine, February 2022. But there's also a set of other government postings that Jake had in the Obama administration, and we'll get to those in the course of the conversation. So let's let this short introduction suffice. Once again, delighted that you can join us today, Jake.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, I want to go back not to ancient history, but something of the distant past, and to Minnesota in the 1980s, and late childhood and early teen years, which correspond to the end phase of the Cold War. I do remember a reference in one of your interviews or writing to the film Red Dawn.
Yeah.
Which I remember seeing as a teenager in upstate New York at the time. And I would like to ask you to start with sort of impressions that you had at that time of the Soviet Union. This is, of course, not a question about policy, but more just about the atmosphere in which you grew up and the role that the Soviet Union played in it.
Well, so I came of age it really in the 1980s. I was born in 1976, but my sentient years were the 1980s, and that was really the Reagan years. And so even though my parents were dyed-in-the-wool Democrats and Walter Mondale was the Democratic presidential nominee in 1984, and the only state he won was Minnesota, nonetheless, my consciousness, I think, on the Soviet Union was shaped in substantial part by Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall, by memories of the Miracle on Ice, by the movie Red Dawn, by Rocky IV, by a sense that, there was this good versus evil struggle of freedom versus communism. It wasn't a time of getting under the desks, fearful of thermonuclear war. It had a more abstract but still inspiring conception to it. And then in 1989, just before my 13th birthday, the Berlin Wall fell. And obviously, a couple years later, events unfolded in the Soviet Union, and it was a heady and kind of dizzying time about freedom and democracy and American power and purpose, and that had a big impact on my thinking about the role of America in the world.
I want to jump forward from there, which is, to me, a very interesting point of departure for the conversation we're about to have. But I want to jump forward there to college years, and then you were overseas at Oxford for 2 years, and then in law school, and simply to ask if there were books that you read at the time, professors that you encountered that again shaped your understanding of the history of the Soviet Union, the sort of end of the Cold War, or perhaps since this period extends already into the early 1990s, sort of post-Soviet Russia. Is there anything that stands out in your recollection? We ask at the Kennan Institute because this is the place that we occupy, and it's of great interest to us how policymakers receive, sort of books and learning and scholarship.
Yeah. So first, I took a course in college from a professor named Gaddis Smith. This is at Yale. Not the same as John Gaddis, who, of course, is the wonderful biographer of George Kennan. But Gaddis Smith taught a course on the Cold War, and it really kind of shaped my thinking about the structural dynamics between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, from 1945 through the fall of the Soviet Union. I then had a thesis advisor named Charlie Hill, who ultimately went on to found the Grand Strategy program at Yale with John Gaddis and Paul Kennedy. And Charlie Hill had a big impact on my thinking about kind of the classics, about Clausewitz and Thucydides, and the way in which those classics mapped onto modern geopolitics. And I just learned a lot, not just, writing my thesis with him, but also engaging in his office hours, sitting across from him, hearing his take on things. Now, he was George Shultz's, I don't know what the title was, but roughly his chief of staff during the 1980s, during those years when I was watching those movies. And so I also got to hear firsthand accounts of diplomacy and statecraft in that period. And then when I was in law school, Strobe Talbott had just left the Clinton administration and had come to Yale to found something called the Center for the Study of Globalization. And he was particularly focused in that time on issues associated with international institutions, economic interdependence, and the like. But of course, I was his research assistant. Not a day would go by in dealing with him where he wouldn't talk about the 90s, the years in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, and his particular stewardship of U.S. policy towards the former Soviet states, towards the newly emerging independent states. And, I got a kind of firsthand perspective from him on both the real opportunities for those countries and also the tremendous headwinds and challenges and risks that they were facing as well.
I'll just identify for the students in our audience the memoir of Strobe Talbott, The Russia Hand, which is with, George Kennan's memoirs and Richard Pipes's memoirs, one of the key books for understanding policy formation toward this part of the world over the last few decades. Let's jump up in time, to the beginning of your career in government. So this is to take the story past the emergence of Vladimir Putin as Russia's president. One never quite knows whether to say late 1999 or very early 2000, but that's the moment Putin becomes Russia's president. Of course, Putin has 2 terms. There were 4 terms back then in Russia. Until 2008, and then in ways that I'm curious to hear you think about. Putin becomes the prime minister. Dmitry Medvedev becomes Russia's president. You enter the Obama administration, working, I believe, at the State Department at the time, and this becomes the period known at the time and since as the reset. I want to start, of course, Putin is in a way the big game for this conversation because the key question for us is why he decided to invade in February 2022. But I want to start not with a Putin question here, but with a Medvedev question. So he's sort of the first Russian president that you encounter, and to start with your impressions and thoughts both about Medvedev and that turn in Russian sort of politics, and then I will want to ask about the reset after that.
Well, the first time I met Medvedev was with Secretary Clinton. If you had told me then he would turn into, one of the world's most prolific Twitter trolls, first of all, I wasn't really familiar with Twitter at that point, although I think it had been created in 2009. I wouldn't have believed it because he was, a fairly cautious, measured, pleasant interlocutor. He took pains to try to indicate a desire to cooperate on things. A very different personality from what he shows the world today. But you also got the sense that this was not a person who was inhabiting the full power of the Russian president, that, he had to look over his shoulder because Vladimir Putin was still there, playing the key role in the leadership of that country. And you could feel that in encounters or engagements with him.
So 2009, to think back to this period, historically, obviously September 11th still resonates in the world and in American foreign policy, but President Obama is elected to do something different. That's sort of the issue, the foreign policy issue, in my recollection, that the 2008 election turns on a different approach to the Middle East. I don't think China had the prominence in 2008, 2009 that it does today. And, Russia was a significant issue up to a point. It's never not a significant issue in American foreign policy, but I wouldn't say that it was front and center. And I'm curious to get your thoughts about the reset, sort of the thinking that had emerged from the assumptions, the expectations, and perhaps also the hopes with the reset. So 2009 roughly to 2011, 2012.
So first, the term reset, I think, first appeared in Vice President Biden's speech at the Munich Security Conference at the beginning of 2009. Someone can check me on that. And that policy was born out of a policy process run by the NSC out of the White House, but obviously involving the departments and agencies. And it was conducted in the shadow, of course, of Russia's invasion of Georgia in August of 2008 during the presidential campaign. Now, that invasion never took on the salience that one might have expected. And I think that's largely because 2008 was such a dramatic year in terms of the global financial crisis. So you have that invasion in August. September, you get the collapse of Lehman and the unraveling, the melting down of the global economy. So I think there never crystallized quite the reaction in the United States or the West to those events that you might have otherwise anticipated would have occurred. But I think when President Obama came in, he had a broad sense of wanting to reset relations with the world, with allies, um, with respect to the Middle East, with respect to the Muslim world. So I think understanding the Russian reset, you have to understand it in the context of just a broader sense of turning the page from the Bush administration and looking for a fresh start to see where the opportunities lay. It was not a purely just optimistic and hopeful policy. There was a recognition that there would be limits to this and that there would be hard issues and that the Russian political system was very different from the American political system and Russian interests different from American interests. But the fundamental notion that we could start with a new page to say, are there areas concretely on which we can effectively cooperate and harvest results? Let's try to do that to the maximum extent possible while that window is open. That was kind of at the core what the reset was about. And the top issues on the agenda, there was obviously New START and trying to get a new nuclear arms limitation treaty in place. Iran and North Korea trying to get cooperation on their respective nuclear programs. And then, of course, there was the issue of Afghanistan and whether or not we could use Russian territory through the Northern Distribution Network to ship supplies to our forces fighting in Afghanistan at a moment when President Obama was dramatically increasing the U.S. presence there, nearly tripling it in size, frankly, over the course of 2009 into 2010. So there was a set of issues. So part of the idea was we can work practically with Russia on this set of issues, make progress, and show that there are tangible ways in which the U.S. and Russia can cooperate, can work together for mutual benefit, for mutual interest. And that's what played out really over the course of the next 2+ years.
It's a hard thing to parse as a historian. When you look back at Medvedev's statements about Ukraine, they're very moderate. And the language of the Russian government, obviously you can read it in a dozen different ways, but even going back to Putin's first two terms is a language that indicates Russia's desire, willingness, almost eagerness to integrate into European structures. Of course, you have the Munich security speech that
Right.
President Putin gives in 2007, but that in some sense he exits the scene a year later, and Medvedev sings a kind of a different tune. Want to ask a sort of mini question about Medvedev and Libya, if there's sort of anything that you would want to fill in that respect. So this takes us up to 2011, shortly before Medvedev is going to exit the scene himself.
Yeah. You know, my experience in that period was really still working for Secretary Clinton, more with Foreign Minister Lavrov than with Medvedev. And Lavrov really was tasked by the Russian president with taking Russia's position forward at the Security Council on that Security Council resolution. And Secretary Clinton had multiple conversations with Foreign Minister Lavrov, trying to convince him to abstain on a resolution that provided for all necessary means to respond to the threat to civilians in Libya. All necessary means, for those who follow UN Security Council resolutions, means effectively an authorization to use military force. And, you know, Lavrov is a very sophisticated guy. Um, sophisticated about the Security Council and the wording of resolutions, sophisticated about American politics and what the debate was inside the US system about the potential for a NATO or US-led action in Libya. And for reasons I still do not fully understand, decided, yeah, okay, we'll go ahead and abstain, which was effectively the equivalent of giving a green light to Security Council authorization for military action in Libya. Very quickly thereafter, he sort of said, and the Russian system said, oh, we got misled into precisely what the Americans were up to. And I think that does not stand up to scrutiny, given how that text was negotiated. But I have never really developed a clear explanation or theory as to why they went from basically saying, okay, that's all right by us, to flipping on it. And, I haven't read an account that to me has given a definitive answer to that question. But it's clear then after that, and I would say really the key moment was not the initiation of military action, but rather the death of Gaddafi and the particular way in which he was tracked down and killed by Libyan rebels, that ended up shaking Putin and ended up shaking the Russian system in a way that led them to completely reframe and recast the Libya issue in much more stark and dramatic terms. But that's supposition on my part.
And I'll highlight for our audience that there are interesting paragraphs in President Obama's memoir, the first volume of his memoir, second volume, where we're waiting for, about Medvedev and how President Obama was reading his motivations at the time. So it's a consequential issue in Russia, because then it figures, these two are sort of difficult details to account for. Not that there's a presidential election really in 2011, 2012 in Russia, or a normal campaign, at least by American standards. But then Putin sort of is publicly critical of Medvedev about what happens in Libya, and then sort of pushes Medvedev aside, and begins to return to power in sort of late 2011 and then 2012. And this seems to me like a significant turning point. It's a turning point for Russia in ways that are obvious at the present moment, but it's sort of the sourness of Putin's mood at that time. But let me simply ask you what your impressions were when Putin came to power. Of course, he publicly confronts Secretary Clinton, accuses her of playing a malign role in Russian politics. And so U.S.-Russian relations, it's sort of like a whiplash moment, go from being relatively cooperative almost overnight into a different domain, because Putin is pressing a very different narrative at that time.
Before I answer that, Michael, I'm curious, just based on how you introduced that question, is it your view that but for Libya, maybe Putin decides not to come back, or?
I think it's a pretext. I think Putin had decided to come back all along.
Yeah. Okay, that's consistent with my understanding.
Medvedev on a short leash, but I think at a time when there was the maybe fact of choice or the illusion of choice in Russian politics, it's something that he can use to create the narrative of himself, the tough defender of Russian interests, and Medvedev as the guy who is somehow in between. That's my impression. I wish I had facts and documents to back it up, but that's my sense.
Got it. So first on the Putin-Clinton dynamic, of course, Secretary Clinton spoke out, with the authorization and support of President Obama on the events of the Russian election, which involved a massive amount of manipulation and repression and so forth. And she had the temerity to say, hey, we have real concerns about the freedom and fairness of this election in Russia. And I think that struck a very deep nerve with Putin, leading him to personally excoriate her. But my view at the time was, as soon as Putin made the decision to come back, we were moving beyond the reset period. We were moving into a different phase of U.S.-Russian relations. The Putin-Clinton dynamic was sort of interesting, but was more a symptom than a cause of all of that. And I was director of policy planning at the time, and along with a Russia expert on my staff, we prepared a draft memo for Secretary Clinton to send to the president, basically saying, we think that the harvest of the reset has been good, and we've made material gains on behalf of the American people in a number of areas. New START, Iran sanctions, North Korea Security Council resolution, Northern Distribution Network, among them. But it's, it's going to get darker now. And we went back and forth within the State Department on that memo for several weeks. And ultimately, Secretary Clinton sent a memo along those lines to President Obama in 2012. And so I think we were basically girding for a shift in the Russian approach and in the U.S.-Russia relationship with the return of Vladimir Putin to the presidency. And Libya definitely cast a shadow because it had become quite personalized for him. But just more generally, it felt like the Putin who was coming back really wanted to play out that Munich 2007 speech more fully, a kind of grievance-fueled narrative about, Western encroachment, oppression, Russia's back being against the wall, Russia needing to push back against a Western, US-led kind of Western imperialist order. All of that was starting to come into view in that 2012 time period. I think overall U.S. policy didn't move on a dime on it, didn't shift to, a much more robust and aggressive strategy. The recognition dawned, and then I think policy sort of shifted a bit more slowly.
Yeah, there's this, to me, somewhat silly line of argument that Putin was psychologically changed or damaged by the pandemic. I just find that a bit hard to believe. I think the changes between, I don't know, 2005 and 2012 in Putin are the significant changes. It's the animosity toward the West, which you've described a moment ago, and a kind of conservatism that you don't see in Putin, an embrace of the church, an embrace of a sort of Russian nationalism that had always been an option for Putin, but he really is much more invested in that by 2012, and it creates a quite different Russia. Before jumping to the events in Ukraine in 2013, 2014, which is to take us in a way to the doorstep of our biggest story to talk about today, I do want to ask about Snowden. And it feels to me like that's, sort of a dramatic issue that when Moscow provides a home for Snowden, or where the Kremlin provides a home for Snowden in Moscow, that takes the trajectory that you're describing, and I think accelerates it. Or
No,
let
no
me ask
doubt.
you if it does.
No doubt. No doubt. Um, this was a basically Putin voting with his feet to say, I'm now shifting into an adversarial posture vis-a-vis the United States. And, particularly given the nature of what Snowden was doing, far beyond simply being a whistleblower, actually um, releasing incredibly sensitive information that put both U.S. personnel and U.S. security at risk, and then going and being greeted in Moscow as a kind of, um, asylum seeker / hero, etc. Putin knew exactly what he was doing, and we knew he knew exactly what he was doing. And I think that that had a material impact on the way that the president and the other senior leadership in the U.S. national security community saw that they saw this as an exclamation point in the downward turn in U.S.-Russian relations.
And I think it has to be part of the context for understanding the very dramatic events of 2013, which I'd like to turn to now. And just first, for your thoughts about the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine, which to me is one of the most unexpected events in sort of recent history. You don't see much evidence that it's going to happen before the fall of 2013, really. In fact, you can kind of go back and watch on YouTube walk through Kiev between President Putin and then President of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, where they sort of go arm in arm, and it seems like Ukraine is inclining toward Russia, and that's the way it's going to be. But then, by November of 2013, certainly by December, Ukraine seems to be in the throes of a revolution. So I'd like to start there, just your sort of your response to that, or your thinking about that, and of course we'll turn to the question of of Russia and its actions in just a moment.
Look, there is this line of argument that the U.S. was kind of the coup plotting superpower, operating by remote control from Washington and directing events. We were spectators as much as anyone else in this. We were watching movement towards an EU association agreement. Our take was that in 2013 that Yanukovych had some tacit understanding with Putin where he could continue to make progress generally towards the EU. Maybe actual EU membership would always be for the future, but that he could keep that path alive while continuing to come closer to Moscow. And then for some reason, Putin decided he couldn't tolerate the EU accession agreement, made this alternative offer to Yanukovych, and Yanukovych basically it made an offer he couldn't refuse. So Yanukovych yanked the plug, and I do believe that that created this spontaneous moment where the people of Ukraine said, "Wait a second, you know, this president is going to take us in a radically different direction, and we want to head in a Western kind of European orientation." And they poured out into the streets. And I think it wasn't a genuine democratic uprising sparked by the very rapid realization by the Ukrainian people that they were being led down a path they did not want to go. And then there was a crackdown. And the US had to think about how do we react to a circumstance in which, in a European capital, we are seeing people being mowed down in the Maidan for peacefully protesting against their leadership for abandoning the European path. And really, the thrust and purpose of U.S. policy in that period was to essentially try to find a resolution to this, so it didn't descend into further bloodshed.
And that resolution, just to stick with this thread for one further question, it's sort of extraordinary to remember back. I mean, various diplomats descend on Kiev in February of 2014. Revolution has definitely reached a higher pitch than it had been in 2013. But on the Russian side, this is very hard to substantiate, at least for us historians. They seem to agree to elections in Ukraine. Don't seem to be very, very enthusiastic about it. You have the EU that is sort of eager for elections in Ukraine, and the hope is that there would be elections in December of 2014. Yanukovych would be president of Ukraine till then, and then by peaceful democratic means, in a sense, this crisis would be resolved. But then Yanukovych flees. Nobody, I think, expects him to do it, but he sort of flees in the third week of February from Ukraine to Russia. If I could just ask you to recall, if you have the thoughts vividly in front of you, sort of the reaction to Yanukovych's flight and to what this signified about that moment.
What I remember, and honestly, it's funny how serving in government's like dog years. So that was more than a decade ago, which means it was more than 70 years ago for me that this happened. So my memory is a bit hazy, but I do have a distinct recollection of being in the Situation Room when we got word that Yanukovych was fleeing, and various senior officials stepping out into the ante room of the Situation Room to get on these secure phones to call to say, what is going on? How do we actually get news about where he went and what is happening in Kyiv? So we were racing to try to keep not even abreast of events, but, sort of behind them, but, not too far behind them to understand what was unfolding. And it took a little while over the course of that day for the picture to become clear that he'd, I think, gone to Rostov.
Right.
And was gone. And at that point, the presidential palace had been taken over by protesters. And now the question was, what is going to happen in terms of a transition of leadership in Ukraine? And that's essentially what the Ukrainian people and the international community were confronted with.
It's an exceptionally dramatic moment, and it's sort of vivid to have that image of you in the Situation Room, sort of taking the news in at the time. Now let's turn sort of back to Russia, and I'll just advance the narrative a bit by sort of fast forwarding 6 months or so. We have the annexation of Crimea, which begins at the end of February 2014, is celebrated in Moscow in a pompous ceremony in March of 2014, and then very chaotic events in eastern Ukraine or the Donbass that lead to a series of military confrontations between Russia and Ukraine. And sort of by late August of 2014, it's clear that in some ways on the battlefield, Russia has the upper hand. This then leads to a round of negotiations in which the United States is not front and center. It's France, Germany, Ukraine, Russia, and it becomes known as the Normandy format or
Right.
Minsk diplomacy. And I want to take the story, quickly past all of this military activity to the diplomacy and to sort of Minsk one and Minsk two, because I do think that this is the necessary historical context for 2022, but we're not at 2022 yet. So 2014, sort of your recollections, your thinking, sort of where things could be moved, what the policy agenda was, let's say September, October of 2014, when Minsk One is coming into place.
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you on this because I left as National Security Advisor to the Vice President in August of 2014. So I walked out the door and my successor, Colin Call, was in the seat when Minsk was actually being negotiated. But as that summer was unfolding, I had kind of two distinct lines of thinking. One was the real challenge of trying to get traction in a negotiation or diplomacy with the Russians when they were basically denying any role in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Right. And I distinctly remember President Obama having conversations with President Putin over that time period where President Putin would say that, that's some freedom fighters in the Donbass, that's got nothing to do with us. And President Obama walking through chapter and verse of the role of the Russian military and getting nowhere. And it was how do you do diplomacy, deterrence, de-escalation when the other side is just simply engaged in a policy of denial? And that was a source of real frustration. And then the second piece was the decision to essentially elevate the Europeans as being in the driver's seat for the mediation, for the facilitation of this negotiation, and the U.S. essentially taking a step back and saying, you guys decide what you think is the right outcome here. It strikes me that in the end, the negotiations would have continued to circle around, but for rapid deterioration on the battlefield for Ukraine and them feeling they basically had to sign something, which led to the Minsk agreement. But I was out of the seat by then, so I'm afraid I can't give you any color from the September-October timeframe.
Got it. And that is gonna that sort of biographical circumstance is gonna be that's going to obtain until January of 2021. So
That's right.
years you're observing what the late Obama administration and then what the Trump administration is doing on these things. I don't want to skip over this period entirely because it is important. One thing that happens in my perception of it, it's sort of obvious in a way, is that the Russia-Ukraine issue starts to get politicized in domestic American politics in a way that it was not in 2014. I don't think that there were, sort of dramatic domestic political issues related to Russia. That's one thing that happens, during the first Trump term. And then it seems to sort of become quiet in a way. You have, Russia's incursion into Syria in 2015. That remains a sort of ongoing story, but not one that really, dramatically intensifies. The fighting along the line of contact in Ukraine never stops. It's always there after 2014, but it's not in huge numbers. And, of course, you have the pandemic, you have lots of other issues. I think for Washington, China starts to occupy a lot more time and attention for policymakers. But any points to make about this period? So this is now fall of 2014 until January 2021 that stands out about either Russia or Ukraine.
Well, one question I would pose to someone who is far more expert in the minds of the Russian leadership than I am. The election of Zelensky, the meeting between Putin and Zelensky,
right?
Basically, was there a period in which Putin thought, with new leadership in Ukraine, post Poroshenko, maybe we can work something out and resolve this. And then over time, coming to the determination, nope, the new guy is same as the old guy. This is going to be impossible. I think that factor is relevant to the reality that we stepped into in the beginning of 2021 was the way in which the Putin-Zelensky relationship had gone from, oh, maybe there's some there to, nope, there's really no there. Uh, so that's one factor that I would flag. And then, you mentioned before you don't put a lot of stock in Putin was psychologically transformed by the pandemic. I think that's an overclaim myself, but I don't think we can entirely discount isolation as a factor in a authoritarian leader facing his mortality, sitting around by himself or with very, small numbers of close advisors who were ideological fellow travelers, and thinking about his legacy and thinking about history and thinking about, you know, um, more audacious projects than he might previously have thought about. So I don't think there was a fundamental shift in Putin in 2020, but I think that the pandemic did play some role in the way that he developed a theory for the subjugation of Ukraine and a massive military operation to bring about that subjugation. I don't have some, you know, you know, absolute iron-side evidence to that effect, um, but that's my perception.
Um, I would just weave in one additional detail there, or trend line. It is in addition to what you say about the pandemic or the isolation, which is that Russia changes from 2012 when it's hard to describe as exactly a democracy, but this kind of unruly place where there is political pluralism and something of an independent media. It evolves from that in 2012 to 2019, 2020, when Russia is really a dictatorship.
Yeah.
And I think dictatorship changes not just the society, but sort of the mood of the leader, because
Yeah.
eccentricities and fears, anxieties, ambitions can all become intensified, and nobody has the power to challenge or say no. And that, to me, feels like a gradual process with Putin. That Putin, the dictator, is just a very different beast from what he was from 2000 to 2008. But uh, by January of 2021, you're certainly no longer an observer of U.S. policy formation toward Russia and Ukraine. You're in a very important place. And so it'd be great to get a sense in those months. 2021 is just such a consequential year, and in this narrative, sort of what it felt like from the beginning. There's the renewal of New Start a few days after President Biden is sworn in, and then a set of initiatives that sort of span the first 5, 6 months of the Biden administration.
Yeah. So just stepping into office, President Biden was confronting a few things on the Russian file. One was SolarWinds, this massive supply chain cyber attack that he had to contend with. Another was a second round of significant Russian election interference in a presidential election, his presidential election against him in favor of Trump. Uh, and then there were these reports about the GRU um, basically working with the Taliban to try to uh, kill American soldiers in Afghanistan. So all of that was kind of coming to a head in the period between November and January, and we came in. And those subject areas featured prominently in the first call between Putin and Biden. And Biden said to Putin, I'm going to have to impose sanctions and costs. That is my responsibility as the American president, and I think it is the right thing to do. At the same time, I want to find ways that the U.S. and Russia can work for stability. And let's get the New START treaty done, extended essentially on current terms, which we did within the first 2 weeks of the president taking office. So at that point, our goal was not reset, but some degree of stability in the relationship to try to manage things so that we could contend with all else that was going on, including the recovery from COVID and, of course, the rise of China. Within a few months, we saw this significant buildup of Russian forces along the border of Ukraine. And the prospect rising that actually this was the real thing and they were going to take some significant military action. At that point, we did not have insight into what the purpose or objective of that buildup was. You know, there was various theories put forward by our intelligence and diplomatic and defense community around a land bridge or expanding the territory in the Donbass. There was not at that point much discussion of take the capital of Kyiv and, you know, essentially subjugate all of Ukraine. But we thought we could be facing a very significant military operation in the spring of 2021. That is part of what motivated President Biden to say to President Putin, let's put a summit on the books. Let's talk. Let's see if we can reach some better understandings of strategic stability writ large. Strategic stability as it related to nuclear, to space, and to an understanding of, you know, the theater, the European theater. So then they meet in Geneva. Before the meeting in Geneva, of course, we had the Colonial Pipeline incident, a ransomware attack by a ransomware attacker based in Russia, and a range of other similar attacks, not quite at that level of magnitude, but a significant ransomware cyber-related threat from Russia. So that became a larger feature of that agenda in the meeting in Geneva. And by then, the Russian buildup had receded. So Ukraine was absolutely a critical topic of discussion, but it was an elusive topic.
Mm.
It was not one where Putin was saying, I demand the following things, or I intend to do the following things. It was very difficult to pin him down on anything on Ukraine. He remained in a quite, for lack of a better term, elusive place on it. So we left uncertain. You know, President Biden made all of the kind of points about, you know, concern about this Russian military buildup and what Russian intentions were, and the ways in which the West would react to further action against Ukraine. But there was nothing really to grab onto in that conversation. And then following that, we saw President Putin's essay, or
That's what I wanted to ask about.
whatever you want to call it, his missive. And that, for close Russia watchers at both state and in the intelligence community, raised significant alarm bells. This was a different way of conceiving and talking about Ukraine than we had seen from President Putin, explicitly at least. It was not inconsistent with kind of how people thought he might be thinking, but for him to go out in that way, in that format, definitely hit home. But people didn't immediately think, okay, now we're going to be facing some massive military initiative here in just a matter of months. That really began to set in the September-October timeframe.
So, you know, 20 years from now, I hope that we can have you back to a conversation like this and talk about the intelligence side. I think it's far too soon to have that conversation. So I want to ask you about something different, something else in September, October, November of 2021. And I think for students, anybody looking for a dissertation topic, I think a day-by-day history of those months in terms of the questions that we're discussing would be a very useful thing to have, whether in Moscow, in Kiev, in Washington, but also sort of Brussels, Berlin, Paris, London. It's an incredibly consequential period in terms of, in some cases, what's happening, what's not happening. But I'm especially curious, and you know, we have the layers of our conversation already to think of back to the 1980s and you know, the sort of post-Soviet period and different periods of interaction and conflict between the United States and Russia. And you, of course, have a familiarity with the figure of Putin. He's not unknown to you in terms of personal encounters and the work that you've been doing. How did you form a sense of his motivations? Right? You never quite know with another person, certainly with a foreign leader, you never quite know, but you have to do your best at guessing. Sort of, it would be very, very helpful to get a sense of how you tried to do that in those incredibly consequential months.
Well, actually, it's interesting. President Biden would invite analysts of Russia from various departments across the US government, people who had studied Putin, to the Oval Office to present to him on how they understood him, his motivations, his objectives, what was driving him, what was making him tick. And he tried to form basically a composite picture through a range of different inputs, including those briefings, including a lot of stuff he read that we all read, and including a pretty close study of Putin, um, the who had an incredibly long transcript, so to speak, of statements over the course of those years. Right, he said a lot, and trying to look at the sum total of that record to see what the repeat themes, the repeat points of emphasis, the repeat grievances, the repeat framings of history, um, and then mapping that on to the inputs we were getting from foreign leaders who were meeting with him. You know, President Biden would talk to people like President Niinistö of Finland or Chancellor Merkel, others who had had extensive dealings with President Putin to try to gain better understanding of what he was thinking, and mapping on to, you know, people had known Putin through different iterations over the years as well, including American interlocutors. So there was a real, I think, concerted effort in 21 to try to understand better what was motivating him, what was driving him, and what his objectives were, and what he intended to do.
Is it possible? I mean, maybe it's too simple of a question, but um, either now or then, when we go to the why of this, sort of why Putin did this, uh, sort of what occurs to you? I mean, there are sort of hundreds of explanations out there. People certainly in among historians, experts really struggle with this. Do you have a kind of rule of thumb explanation when it comes to why Putin did it?
I do, but I have humility on that because, you know, there are people who have spent their entire lives just studying this issue. You know, I've obviously dealt with this issue intensively in incredible painstaking detail, but had to deal with a ton of other issues as well. And so I'm not going to say that I have the oracle on this by any stretch, but my rule of thumb explanation is, in a way, an Occam's razor explanation. It is, listen to what he says on the subject. And that is, if he does not believe that Ukraine has independent nationhood, he believes that Ukraine is, in fact, part of greater Russia, and that it was his responsibility as a historic leader of Russia to bring Ukraine back into the fold. I think that is the answer. I find the arguments about NATO expansion and the particularities of diplomacy over Minsk or other things to be a bit of a sideshow to what fundamentally is a story about his view of Russian history and his place in it and what Ukraine meant for that. And as you've seen the war unfold, I've only gained more conviction in that, because his determination to see through this war to a conclusion where Ukraine is brought to heel at such immense cost to his country goes to show you that this for him is a priority over almost all else. And you know, if it were simply a matter of NATO membership or something, this war would have long since been over.
And sort of the place of Ukraine in all of this. Of course, it's a Russian act that's going to begin the war, but it's Ukraine um, that's going to defend itself. Is there a sort of general set of concepts that you were working with at the time? I mean, I think the war has, as every war has been, profoundly unpredictable.
Yeah.
It's in its contours, and we're not in this conversation, I think, going to go into the war itself. We'll sort of stop at February 2022, but a kind of sense of where Ukraine was in the fall of 2021.
Well, look, fundamentally, when we start getting the intelligence that we declassified that Russia is going to launch this massive invasion, what's the first thing I do? The first thing President Biden does, first thing Tony Blinken does, we go to the Russia experts across our government and say, what can we do to keep this from happening? And the answer basically came back, not much. Sanctions aren't going to stop him. Arming up Ukraine's not going to stop him. Making offers around the margins of European security architecture is not going to stop him. So the question facing the president fundamentally was, to prevent Russia, to deter Russia, or to physically stop Russia would require the United States basically to go to war, to put U.S. troops in to say, we're going to fight. And President Biden was not prepared to do that. From early on, he took the position, we will support Ukraine through the provision of weapons, intelligence, and other forms of support, but we will not put U.S. troops into this fight. And the Ukrainians, through that period, the fall of 2021, I think at a senior level, did not really believe the American assertion that they were coming for Kyiv, that Russia was coming for Kyiv. Did not really believe it. Didn't believe it even as late as the weeks and days leading up to the war. They thought, no way, he's not going to do it. And did not like us going out and shouting from the rooftops that he was, because from their perspective, this was undermining confidence, undermining the economy, et cetera. So what we tried to do in those weeks leading up was create the operational mechanism to be able to flow weapons in at great scale. We delivered weapons over the fall of 21, and then built a whole logistical footprint to be able to flow them in very fast during hostilities. I will confess, not confess, I mean, this has been well documented. We expected that the most likely outcome was that Kyiv would fall, because that is what all of our experts told us, that the Russian military would be able to take Kyiv. So a lot of our military planning was about how to fight a war in which Russia had already taken a really significant amount of territory, including the capital. And so a lot of planning went into a different scenario than the one that ended up playing out. Of course, a lot of planning went into protecting Kyiv, and the United States, I think, played a critical role from an intelligence provision perspective and the supplies of javelins and stingers to help save Kyiv. I mean, nothing compared to what the Ukrainians did themselves with their bravery and courage. But it definitely colored the preparation for the war, that there was an expectation that the capital would fall. And when that didn't happen, we had to shift course to a more prolonged campaign that included artillery and all of these other capabilities that we began to flow in.
So I have one final question, and I'll invite further questions from the audience, although we have quite a few in the Q&A function. So I'll turn to those by way of conclusion. But I'm thinking of the university where you're teaching, and a particular scholar there, Ernest May, who was very interested in the question of historical analogies and wrote a great book on how historical analogies get used in the policy process. One example comes to mind, not from the U.S. government, but from the German government, which is apparently Angela Merkel, who read the book Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark about the First World War, and it really shaped her thinking about how to respond to annexation of Crimea and events in 2013, 2014. She didn't want to sleepwalk into another world war. I want to ask you about, in this year, 2021, if there were any analogies that you found useful or maybe not so useful. I mean, you could turn back to the Cold War to think about what was happening. I mean, what was appearing on the horizon is the most consequential conflict in Europe since 1945. So one could turn back to, sort of former Yugoslavia in the 1990s and sort of that moment. First World War, Second World War are always available for reflection. But was it possible at that time to sort of plug in any analogies, or did it just feel like everything was so sui generis that that wasn't the right way to think about what was happening?
Well, you asked me before about books and classes or professors who stood out to me in college and in grad school and law school. I neglected to mention one, which is I took a course called Making Foreign Policy by Historical Analogy. That was the name of the course. It was taught by H. Bradford Westerfield. We've read May's book, but we also read a book by a professor named Yuen Pung Kong called Analogies at War. And that book kind of drove home to me the pitfalls and risks of too heavily analogizing to anything. And I felt this was a sui generis situation, because it would be the first time that you would have a massive conventional invasion to take the capital of another country in Europe by a nuclear armed power, and that country in question was not in NATO. So we had to contend essentially with that set of factors. And so we cast about for whether there could be lessons learned from, other similar situations, and had a difficult time doing so because of the sui generis nature of this particular scenario.
I wonder if Ernest May wouldn't, in a sense, be pleased with the answer, because I think one of the things he wanted to do with that book is to liberate, especially from the Munich analogy, which can be, kind of a overbearing analogy when it comes to foreign policy conversations. But the absence of analogy is a sort of an interesting place to be, and sort of intellectually interesting to think about. I'm going to turn now to a question that comes from an audience member. And this is about the ultimatums that Russia issued, not really to the US or not directly to the US, but more to Europe in late 2021. And this is, sort of things that Russia was asking for, and, sort of how you viewed that. There was that very frenetic period between December 2021 and January 2022, where there are all these meetings and sort of back and forth, and Russia is asking for things right and left. So the question is what you thought about that.
So we received two documents. One was a U.S.-Russia treaty, and the other was a U.S.-NATO treaty. It fully baked drafts from the Russians in December, with basically a take it or leave it ultimatum. And our view was that this reinforced the perspective of our Russia experts, who said Russia's pell-mell doing this; they're not going to be moved off it. But it also made us think we need to play this out to expose Russia as being unserious, meaning we have to engage in a round or multiple rounds, if possible, of diplomacy, and respond to these ultimatums with some constructive proposals of our own. So, among other things, these draft treaties said that NATO had to be rolled back to pre-1997 realities, all kinds of things about disposition of forces, of capabilities, and so forth. No more NATO expansion, that kind of thing. So we actually developed, both with NATO for the NATO-Russia treaty and our own, in consultation with the Europeans, U.S.-Russia proposal in response to what they put forward, and sent them to the Russians and negotiated over them, or said we were prepared to negotiate over them. They were our constructive proposals for European security that got buy-in from the Europeans. And they went nowhere, because Russia was doing this as essentially a show exercise, not as something serious. We were putting something serious on the table that could have been a basis for further discussion, and they simply didn't take it up. And it was clear from Ryabkov, who was the lead negotiator on the Russian side, he had no flexibility to actually negotiate in a meaningful way. He was there essentially to say, take it or leave it.
Okay, I'm going to turn to another question from our audience, which is about causes of the conflict that could be rooted not in the US-Russian relationship, but in events happening in Ukraine. We've already talked about 2013, 2014, but this questioner is curious about, the place of President Zelensky circa 2020, 2021, and the arrest of Viktor Medvedchuk, and sort of internal affairs that are happening in Ukraine. And the question is whether Putin might have been reacting or responding to that, or to what degree he was.
I mean, my view is that he essentially, and I alluded to this in kind of the disillusionment of Putin toward Zelensky as being a factor that unfolded over the course of late 2019, 2020 into 2021. And I think things like Medvedchuk reinforce that. But basically, I think Putin thought maybe Zelensky will do a deal in the Normandy format that's fundamentally advantageous to Russia. Zelensky would not do that, would not make dramatic concessions. Putin decided, okay, I guess I'm not going to get what I want from these guys at the negotiating table. And then I don't think any particular feature of the internal Ukrainian political jockeying was all that additive. It was a basic decision he made probably at some point in 2020. I can't deal with this guy. And then a shift to what am I going to do about the Ukraine question in light of that? And that's how he developed this grand scheme.
So another question, which I find a very interesting one, uh, is about Russian misreadings of Ukraine and sort of Russian misjudgments. Maybe this takes us more to the war itself, which I think is a separate conversation. But I'm curious if preemptively one could have or did consider the things that Russia would get wrong, not just the things that Russia would do in Ukraine, but its kind of misjudgments. It's maybe a lot to ask to sort of anticipate
No,
of one's adversary, but was that possible?
I think this is a really important point. I believe that the Russian war plan was predicated on a very critical premise, which was Russian forces can roll into cities, Chernihiv or Dnipro or Sumy or Kyiv itself, and that they can establish a sufficient degree of security and credibility that they could, in fact, then engineer a political thing. That was the special military operation was drive to Kyiv, drive into these other cities, face little resistance, and essentially have, Russian intelligence units take over, identify some locals who would be, sympathetic, and we'll run the place. And there was a sense that this was totally possible. Almost the kind of Iraq war analogy of we'll be, greeted as liberators. Not, I wouldn't quite go that far, but it's a cousin of that kind of thinking. Was there some way to disabuse Russia of that? I don't know. The U.S. could have done so. Was there something Ukraine could have done to do so? I'm not sure.
Mm. Now we have many, many questions about NATO expansion, which take different tacks on us. So I'm just going to amalgamate it into a general one. You've already argued that you don't think NATO expansion is an organic or direct cause of the war, which you identify the true causes of the war in Russia's relationship to Ukraine and unwillingness to let Ukraine move in a westward direction. Since our audience is so interested in the topic, I do want to ask the question again. Maybe the best way to ask the question is just where does NATO figure in all of this for Russia? Maybe in two respects. I mean, there's the question of NATO expansion, which of course, we have Sweden and Finland for later consideration. But there's just the question of NATO as such. Sort of NATO is there. It's not far from Ukraine. Where do you think this figured in Russian thinking, and where would you place the NATO issue in Putin's approach? More on the propaganda side or more on the strategy side?
I think there are two issues here. One is Ukraine in NATO, and the other is NATO in Ukraine. So on the question of Ukraine in NATO, there were multiple different ways in which it was communicated to Putin. As a practical matter, Ukraine wasn't joining NATO anytime soon. So surely there was some way to figure that issue out. Putin never even remotely bit at that because, as I said before, I don't think this was fundamentally his issue. When he spoke to Biden, he frequently talked about the flip side of it, which was NATO and Ukraine. I don't want US or NATO combat forces in Ukraine. I don't want US missiles in Ukraine pointed at Russia where they could reach, Russian cities in a blink of an eye. And there on NATO and Ukraine, President Biden was very straight with Putin. We can work that out. That there's no let's talk about what your particular security concerns are, particular capabilities, long range missiles, what have you. Like we can work that out. Putin did not bite at that at all. So Were these subjects of discussion in that period? Ukraine and NATO, NATO and Ukraine? Yes. Were these, strings that we could pull to avert war? Every indication we had through that period was no, because Putin was invading Ukraine for a totally separate historical reason related to his view of Ukrainian nationhood or lack thereof, and his place in Russian history. So that is my strong view. And I think if it had been about NATO, either which way for Putin, there were plenty of opportunities for him um, to test what was possible in the discussions.
We're reaching the end of our time, so I'm going to ask a final question, which is the kind of question that matters to us here at the Kennedy Institute, in a sense, matters most, and hopefully will allow us to come, sort of full circle in the conversation. And this is, when you think forward now that you're in an educational role among other roles that you have at the present moment, what do you recommend for young people who want to work in the policy space, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, Eastern Central Europe? What do you recommend studying? What do you recommend, sort of thinking about? What do you recommend learning that could help for the best possible policy formation in this region?
One of the things that I have been preoccupied by since leaving, which isn't unique to the region, but is very much brought front and center by this war, is how to think about questions related to escalation. And actually, my colleague, Rebecca Lissner, and her co-author have a piece coming out in the next issue of Foreign Affairs that tries to draw lessons from Ukraine in this regard. I don't agree with every word of the piece, but I think it is extremely smart and extremely thoughtful in how it grapples with these questions, particularly the kind of US-Russia dynamic or the NATO-Russia dynamic. So that's one thing. I think a second is less to do with how this war started than how the war was prosecuted. What will developments in military technology do to the offense-defense balance, and what will it do to the ability of larger countries to menace smaller countries on their borders? I think that's a big topic that deserves further study and has implications for Russia and its neighbors, and also has implications, globally as well. And then finally, is there a way for Russia to become a more normal country? Even if Putin leaves the scene, or when Putin leaves the scene. Its relationships with its neighbors, its relationships with other significant countries like the US are so abnormal. I mean, just so, I think the technical term is effed up in a way. Anyway, so for students of actually Russian politics, Russian history, Russian statecraft, is the previous search for a reset, or the previous search for stability, or the previous search for multiple presidencies to find some path to normalcy in the US-Russia relationship, but also in Russia's relations with its near abroad, is that just, a totally lost cause, or is that something still an aim point for the future, and some, different constellation of Russian leadership? So those are some thoughts I have on questions I've been thinking about.
Well, very much appreciated, and I think form a kind of intellectual agenda that I truly believe is the underpinning and the foundation of good policy formation. So I think for us here, the sort of perfect place to end the conversation. But Jake, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, for sharing with us, sort of insight across your career and many different viewpoints on the problem that is this region, and we're enormously grateful for your doing this.
Thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Take care.